about the Divine Comedy. Stairway to Heaven, this exhibition that's here at the Biggs Museum, this is two different sets of prints, two different sets of illustrations representing two different book projects. One from the 1930s, very early in Salvador Dali's career, and then one from the 1950s, about 1960, much later in Dali's career. But both represent kind of high points in that career. Today, we're actually going to be talking about the Divine Comedy, the project that he did from about 1951 to 1960. And we decided to do that because, frankly, these are a lot of the images that we're using in our marketing. They're probably the images that you folks are probably most familiar with Dali, and part of that's by design. This was a project that he did to, I think, I'm feeling that he did this in order to attract very large appeal. I feel like this was a project that he did to get a lot of attention internationally and decidedally in America. So he and his wife, Gala, they actually left Europe. Salvador Dali was from Spain, and he and his wife left France just at the outset of World War II and ended up in the United States, stayed for a few years after the war, and then eventually ended up back in, I believe that they returned back to Spain. But he and his wife kept a relationship, building a patron base in the United States for years afterwards. And so I think that part of what we're seeing here in the Divine Comedy is a project that would appeal to American sensibilities, which I think is really interesting in terms of overall market. So what is the Divine Comedy? The Divine Comedy is literally it's a poem that was written at around 1300 by Dante Alighieri. I was trying to practice that earlier, and I was not doing very well at it. And I know that every Italian on the show tonight is probably about to hang up on me because he is literally the most important poet of the Italian culture. So from about 1300, he lived from 1265 to 1321, and 700 years after his birth, the Italian government was planning to celebrate his life, celebrate his existence, his accomplishments in Italy with a republishing of the Divine Comedy, one of probably his best known poem, this epic poem made up of 100 cantos. They contracted with Salvador Dali to do the illustrations. He, in this period, in the 1950s, 1960s, was on the cover of Time Life magazine. He was international superstar of the art world. He was sensational. People adored him, had a great fan base, and they said, well, this will bring us a lot of attention. Salvador Dali jumped at the opportunity. He was always kind of a self-promoter. He was always kind of a showman. And so what we see happening is that Salvador Dali started to create 100 watercolors. Each watercolor was to accompany one canto of the epic poem of the Divine Comedy. And unfortunately, the Italian government, probably somewhat fueled by the Vatican, they had to step away from the deal with Salvador Dali. What would have been probably the most expensive book project ever known in mankind's history had to be scrapped with Salvador Dali because of Salvador Dali's earlier life. And he was kind of a known heretic. He separated himself from the church many, many years before. He was religiously skeptic. He lived in this really, really outrageous, extravagant, lascivious lifestyle in his earlier years. And he was kind of a bad boy of the art world, and you can imagine it. And so when we are talking about Salvador Dali in the 1950s, he has created this new direction for himself. And part of it was that he was trying to explore his native Catholicism, but also just enveloping a new sense of mysticism in his artwork. He was really kind of in a redemptive role in his life and a sort of redemptive period in his life. And at the same time, I think that he, having been shunned by the surrealist artists and writers around him, was finding a new area for himself. So using some of his old symbolism, but for new messaging. And the messaging was much more positive, much more introspective, or I should say much more extroverted. So thinking more about how he connects with the rest of the world as opposed to just what's in his own head. And but the work is also much brighter, much more uplifting, and ultimately much more popular. So the book project that fueled the images that we see in this part of the exhibition did not go through, but Salvador Dali contracted with various printers anyways in order to produce them. So he takes his original 101 watercolors and he has them reproduced in woodblock prints or using woodblock print technologies. I think that they were actually not cut exclusively from wood. I think that they were also cut from acrylic, but we'll get into that in just a moment. There were 3 known sets of these prints. There is a French set, so with the text of the Divine Comedy and the illustrations combined together in French. There are about 4,700 copies of that set of 100 prints from the Divine Comedy known to have been produced. There was a subsequent Italian set of over 3,000 copies and a German set, which we have on view here in the museum, of about 1,000 additional copies. So there are, at least that we know of, at least 9,000 sets, not all of them together, of course, but 9,000 sets of the print project that you see here within the museum floating around within the world. Many of them split up and owned individually, 2 pieces here, 1 piece there. What's interesting about this is that because of the technique used to produce this, every image, so every time one of these images is produced, is completely unique, or rather unique, I should say. Salvador Dali worked with various printers in order to produce the images that we're seeing in this project. He oversaw the imagery, the translation of that imagery into individual blocks, oversaw the printing process, oversaw the coloration that was being used. The camera is moving upward. And he basically oversaw the entire process of how these things were produced. But there were always variations. Each of these prints were created by sometimes 5, sometimes as many as 30 individual blocks to create them. Every time you see any little variation of the colors that you see in this, whether it's a dark blue versus a light blue, or a red versus a pink, or an orange versus a coral, every different color is a different block onto the surface of these prints. And so this really, really, really complicated, labor-intensive process for 100 different images created over 3,500 individually carved blocks in order to produce. This is a very expensive printing process, especially for a project at this scale. But it was always intended to be done in woodblock prints because as each block gets individually inked by the printer, you're able to create an effect that looks very much like the watercolor that Salvador Dali had originally used. The ink is applied in this very loose, wet manner that creates these very sort of liquid shapes upon, or can create very liquid kinds of shapes upon the surface of the paper. And that's really exciting to watch. That's very exciting process in order to see firsthand within the exhibition. So when you get a chance, come and see this show.